Hey everybody, and welcome to the Funky Diabetic Podcast with your host, Kate E. Tassi. The purpose of this podcast is to share the struggles, achievements, insights, and opinions of diabetics, their loved ones, and the medical professionals that provide them guidance and treatment. These episodes will feature stories that will inspire, dissuade, entertain, and educate. My hope is that with each episode, it will leave you with some degree of comfort, camaraderie, or empathy, whether or not diabetes has ever touched your life in any way thus far. You should know that none of the statements made within this podcast should be construed as medical or legal advice in any way. Any changes made to your diet or diabetes management should be made only after consulting with a medical professional. Now, without further ado, please enjoy the Funky Diabetic Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to the first full episode of the Funky Diabetic Podcast, which I've entitled Viva la Revolucion. I have to give a huge thanks and issue another big apology to today's guest, Dr. Victor Montori of the Mayo Clinic and the Patient Revolution. He was gracious enough to speak with me on Zoom for an hour on June 3rd, only to have me email him minutes later and tell him that my internet connection completely messed up the recording. I was about to try and write up a summary of our conversation and post it on funkydiabeticpodcast.com, but I knew it would lack the power and persuasion of hearing Dr. Montori speak in his own words. He so generously offered to re-record the answers as to each question I had asked him during the original interview, and that's what you'll be hearing today. You'll hear my recorded question or comment followed by his recorded answer. I do apologize that you're not going to hear the back and forth flow of our actual conversation, but that's entirely my fault. I was trying to simultaneously record the audio and video of our conversation so that I could post it on YouTube, despite the fact that Dr. Montori was pointing out that it was slowing down my internet connection. In the future, I'm going to remind myself that this is first and foremost an auditory medium, and unless I get a faster and more reliable internet connection, I'm going to keep the audio as my top priority. Anyway, on to the episode. As I've said, my guest is Dr. Victor M. Montori. He is a professor of medicine at the Mayo Clinic, an endocrinologist and health services researcher. He is the author of more than 650 peer-reviewed publications. He's among the top 1% of researchers with most cited papers in clinical medicine and in social science worldwide in the last decade. He serves in the editorial advisory board of the BMJ, the board of Academy Health, and as director of late-stage translational research at the Mayo Center for Clinical and Translational Science. He's a recognized expert in evidence-based medicine and shared decision-making, which we'll be talking a bit about in today's episode, and is co-developer of the concept of minimally disruptive medicine, which we'll also get to. He works in Rochester, Minnesota at the Mayo Clinic's CUR unit, which is also known as the Knowledge and Evaluation Research Unit, and as part of that unit, works to advance person-centered care for patients with diabetes and other chronic conditions. He's the author of the book We Revolt, A Patient Revolution for Careful and Kind Care. Now, I have to say, I am glad to have Dr. Montori on as this podcast's first guest for a number of reasons. First and foremost, he is a diabetic specialist, an endocrinologist, and he's done a lot of work to better understand the struggles and realities of a diabetic's daily life. With that being said, I actually didn't get around to asking him many diabetes-specific questions. The two biggest reasons why I'm so happy he's my first guest are, number one, because his work and his book apply to every single one of us, whether you're in perfect health or chronically diseased like me. And number two, because his book and our conversation draw a lot of parallels to the fight for the criminal justice system's reform. Dr. Montori and I spoke on Wednesday, June 3rd, just 9 days after George Floyd, an unarmed, physically restrained black man, was killed by a seemingly calm white Minneapolis police officer kneeling on his neck for almost 9 full minutes. According to at least one video taken of the homicide, the officer continues to kneel on Mr. Floyd's neck even after Floyd lost consciousness and for a full minute after paramedics arrived. Oh, and doing so despite the fact that Mr. Floyd made it clear he couldn't breathe, while numerous onlookers called out for help, and while the officer's co-workers stood by and did nothing to intervene. And while this podcast is not focused on police brutality or the criminal justice system, but is instead focused on diabetes, the lives of diabetics, and a discussion about healthcare in broader terms, there are many similarities between Dr. Montori's critiques of and suggestions for an improved healthcare system and the critiques of and suggestions for a better criminal justice system. I think it's pretty clear both systems are broken. Both systems aren't equitable, especially when applied to those with limited finances and those who are persons of color. Those who work in the trenches and essentially perform daily triage to help as many people as they can are often understaffed, underfunded, undervalued, and overworked. They experience empathy fatigue and emotional burnout and can sometimes feel as if they're fighting against the tide, wondering whether their individual efforts are making a bit of difference in the end. Onlookers of both systems may well agree that they are broken systems, but do little to nothing to join in the fight to make things better. And for many at the top, they're just out to make the biggest financial profit they can, with very little concern as to whether the system they're running effectuates health, safety, or justice for anyone. Now, I know that each of you has a lot of going on in your life right now. We've just gone through, hopefully, the worst of a pandemic, and it's hard to give broader problems like a broken and racist criminal justice system and an inequitable and often ineffective healthcare system too much of your time and energy. But I hope you'll be inspired to get more involved by the end of this episode. We cannot just stand by, throwing up a hashtag on Instagram, and wait until someone smarter and more energized figures out how to solve these problems. As we saw during COVID-19, we need each other in trying times, and can do so much good when we rally together. So without further ado, I present to you my reproduced interview with Dr. Victor Montori. Welcome to the show, Dr. Montori, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me. I am a huge fan of your book, We Revolt, and I was wondering if you could explain a bit to my listeners about your work in the Cur unit at the Mayo Clinic, as well as your work with the Patient Advisory Group. Has your time hearing from and working with patients helped you in any way to become a better clinician?
The care unit started in 2004, and from the beginning we decided to have a close partnership with patients. Our intention was to understand how the clinical encounter between patients and clinicians is a term that I use to describe anybody with the privilege of being at the bedside of the patient. We wanted to understand and study and improve the efficacy of the clinical encounter. And so we couldn't do that without active patient participation and involvement in our research activities. And so from the beginning, we've had these conversations with patients that form an advisory group for our unit. Since then, with some interruptions, but we've been meeting mostly in an uninterrupted fashion since about November 2004 to today, the third Monday of every month from 5:30 to 7. And it's been a wonderful experience. We've learned a few things. They've learned a few things about research, and we've learned a few things about what patients expect from research participation and how they might contribute. We learn a lot about generosity, of course, and their solidarity. We've learned that oftentimes in research we take patient effort, time, and attention for granted, and sometimes we collect that one additional question or that one additional scale with, or we have that additional blood draw, which is nice to have or good to have, or perhaps we will need it later, but each one of those things is a burden on patients that we are happy to justify on scientific grounds. But when you discuss it with patients, you realize that perhaps it is worthwhile to avoid such things. And so, soon enough, you realize that there are ways of conducting research about patient-centered care that it's itself patient-centered and minimally disruptive.
I should note that during our original Zoom conversation, Dr. Montori pointed out that the patient advisory group has been meeting for over 15 years and is completely voluntary based. And while he's incredibly grateful to the group members for being so devoted to the cause, he also recognizes the potential limitations of the feedback the clinic's been receiving from a group of people who are financially stable and have enough free time to devote to this endeavor. Dr. Montori and his colleagues are aware that the feedback is likely missing perspectives from those who have limited means, who might be working multiple jobs and are too busy to join, or are from more diverse backgrounds. The fact that he and his colleagues are aware of this and factor in those limitations is one of the things that really impresses me with his work, his book, his movement. He and his colleagues seem to want to get every single perspective of any potential patient who could walk through those clinic doors, the hospital doors, the doctor's office doors, and they want to see what hurdles they might face, what struggles they may encounter, what obstacles they may have to overcome, and then work with them to find solutions to those problems. He's well aware that many of us, in fact all of us, have other stressors and obligations in our lives in addition to taking care of our health. You might be working 2 jobs, raising children, taking care of an ailing loved one, having relationship problems, whatever it is. Treatment plans need to fit with the needs and life situations of the individual patient. And that's what Dr. Montori calls minimally disruptive medicine. He also vehemently opposes referring to absentee or struggling patients as being quote-unquote non-compliant. That kind of judgment can drive a lot of patients underground and is unlikely to be effective in helping patients become compliant. It also ignores the fact that many of us termed non-compliant are quite capable people. In fact, we may thrive in many other areas of our lives. So instead of guilting us for not being the perfect patient or somehow viewing us as being incompetent, Dr. Montori asks other doctors to change their language and try and figure out why these patients aren't complying with their doctor's advice fully and consistently. Here's Dr. Montori with more on the issue.
One of the opportunities that we've identified in careful and kind care is to notice how many of our patients, particularly those living with chronic conditions, are quite overwhelmed by living their lives and the conditions of living in which they have to do so. They're often these are often the patients who healthcare labels as non-compliant because they don't do what we ask them to do. But one of the works that we've been doing with the book and speaking to clinicians is to change the language related to this, again with the purpose of changing the way people think and act, and proposing that we see folks. That we stop labeling people, but rather their situation. And they're not non-compliant people. I mean, if one looks carefully, we see people being extremely compliant with roles of mother and spouse and worker and taking care of a sandwich generation of kids and older parents. And these are amazing people oftentimes, but we like to think of them having a capacity to do the work and a workload, and sometimes they're just overwhelmed. And so when they come for care and we transfer errands and give them tasks without having a deeper appreciation, seeing their situation in high definition, understanding what is the work that they already have and what capacity they can mobilize to implement this work. When we just transfer that work without paying attention, and then that work doesn't get done, we shouldn't be labeling their character, but we should actually labeling the situation as an imbalance of workload and capacity. And I've been, sort of teaching this to healthcare professionals so that they can begin to make those assessments, diagnose those situations, and respond by either, moderating their demands if that's possible, maybe even removing things that we have asked patients to do in the past that no longer are necessary, but also to boost people's capacity that is sometimes personal, but oftentimes social. And in today's day and age, with substantial isolation and loneliness, oftentimes this capacity is quite limited. So there's an opportunity to care for people just simply by moving away from that label of noncompliance and recognizing that workload and capacity balance that is so tenuous. And this is, of course, another point of connection between patients and clinicians, because clinicians also have a certain capacity and a certain workload that often becomes imbalanced. And just like 40% of our clinicians report symptoms of burnout, 40% of our patients, when we measure their burden of treatment, have crossed the threshold above which people say that the work that healthcare is asking them to do is no longer sustainable. So one of the goals of Careful and Kind Care is to implement this form of minimally disruptive medicine, particularly for patients with multiple chronic conditions.
As I describe in my book, Relentless: From National Champion to Physically Disabled Activist, I've been judged for my brittle diabetes by multiple doctors, some of whom I had just met, and several times when I was doing everything in my power to try and be stable and have my diabetes under control. Unfortunately, the fear of being judged when I was neglecting my diabetes only made me reschedule and cancel my appointments with my diabetic specialist for years. What kept me coming back to her, besides her calling me out for it, was the fact that she didn't judge me, but instead she showed genuine concern for my health and my future and worked with me to figure out what was going on, why I wasn't being quote-unquote compliant, and to figure out how to get things under better control. It's hard for even the most diligent and dedicated diabetic, how do you like that for alliteration, to keep their disease under control over the entire span of living with the illness. I myself have felt a significant amount of embarrassment, guilt, and resentment over my inability to get my blood sugar under better control. The last thing I need is for a medical professional, especially one who has never personally felt what it's like to live with the disease, to judge me for not doing a better job at it. So I really appreciate the effort that Dr. Montori and his colleagues are taking to understand the human being's struggle and let them know that they're there to help support them and work with them to get their health in better order and to make sure that they're doing what they can to take care of themselves. It's a sad fact that this kind of empathy coming from doctors and medical professionals is pretty rare nowadays. Unfortunately, the current healthcare system focuses much more on financial profit and efficiency than it does on caring for patients and working to better understand their struggles and needs. That's why Dr. Montori has called for a patient revolution. Here's more from Dr. Montori on what the revolution entails and what he sees for its future.
Because we see that the healthcare system has corrupted its mission and has stopped caring, we've called for a nonviolent patient revolution. This is an initiative that hopes to promote care that is not about patients like this, but about this patient. Care that is not taking place in a bunch of transactional encounters, but in the context of relationships of love. A healthcare that is not so focused on efficiency as it is focused on elegance, in which there is no waste, but there's also no haste, in which decisions are made in the context of unhurried conversations, and systems are developed around the notion of solidarity rather than greed. And the Patient Revolution has had a number of initiatives. One, the publication of the book Why We Revolt, a patient revolution for careful and kind care. It's a collection of essays that the primary role or goal of this book is to promote the use of a language to describe what we see, a language that we think might lead to different ways of thinking and subsequently different ways of acting, such that we might eventually arrive at an unstoppable evolution, if not a revolution, that turns away from these industrial approaches and embraces approaches that allow us to care for everyone, again, in a careful, that is safe and scientific and kind in the way that is respectful of people's time, energy, and attention, and that we are able to do it for everyone. We recognize that mission might take multiple generations, and in the book we speak of building cathedrals as an image of what it might take, a multi-generational commitment to build something absolutely beautiful, something that we can be proud of, and that it will serve future generations in ways that the current healthcare system cannot. One of the initiatives of the Patient Revolution is this book. Another one is a website where we have a library of stories that we invite people to tell us about in response to the book. We have some tools and things people can use in the clinical encounter to make it better for them. But we needed something that will be a demonstration of the principles that I just talked about. And so we're planning at the moment a demonstration site, a Patient Revolution clinic, a place where we will take care of sick people first and foremost, but also a place where tired and burned out clinicians can stop, like a monastery on the side of the road, and reconnect with their commitment to care and be renewed in that commitment. A place that will evaluate and cultivate new forms of care, like a greenhouse, and a place perhaps like a public library in which the community can come together and learn not only how to advocate for careful and kind care, but also become activists in that journey. So we're trying to build this Patient Revolution clinic at the moment, and to help us with this, we have another initiative that runs in parallel, which is a Patient Revolution Fellowship. We're prototyping this, but the idea is to have folks from all over the world with different talents and different backgrounds come together to help us flesh out what this clinic would do in each of these components, and to make it a successful beacon of hope and a symbol of what we all desire for healthcare in the future.
As you just heard Dr. Montori explain, he envisions Patient Revolution clinics being a resource for anyone and everyone to obtain careful and kind healthcare, but also to be places in which the community can learn more about health and wellness, and for healthcare professionals to be re-energized and replenished when they're burnt out and discouraged. Now, I am very critical of judgmental, money-hungry, ignorant, uncaring doctors, and anyone who will read my book or listen to me in the future will hear that from me. They're out there, just as there are money-hungry, uncaring, judgmental lawyers, and I've been colleagues with many of them. In our original Zoom conversation, Dr. Montori and I agreed that there are members of both of our professions that really shouldn't be practicing medicine or law. Those people often care only about themselves and their bottom line, and can do more damage than good for their patients or clients. But we also have to recognize that both of these systems are broken and harmful not only to the patients and clients, but also to the doctors, lawyers, and support staff who are well-intentioned, dedicated, hardworking, caring people who are often left to put Band-Aids on bullet holes. As Dr. Montori notes in his book, as well as what we all just saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, healthcare professionals are hurting too. Many of them are overworked, understaffed, forced to see far more patients each day than could be feasible to provide quality and focused care to, forced to write long, duplicative, mostly copy and pasted electronic medical notes during their patient visit, wasting at least half the time that they actually have to spend with their client or patient in order to meet federal regulations and obtain better reimbursement from the insurance companies, and so on. And they're also facing their own struggles, be it time spent away from their loved ones, financial obligations, student loan debt, their own health concerns, trying to have a personal life, whatever it is. When you see them for your annual visit, they might already be 90 minutes behind schedule, they might have had a fight with their spouse the night before, didn't have time to eat lunch today, whatever it is. The current healthcare system makes it very difficult for doctors to provide careful and kind healthcare to each and every patient. Those who do fight against the demands of the business side of healthcare in order to care for their patients often end up burnt out and emotionally exhausted. Dr. Montori reminds us that a revamp of the healthcare system needs to also include caring for and retaining quality, well-intentioned healthcare professionals.
We all know some folks who are miscast, that show up to take care of patients, but should probably not be doing that. They may not be in a position to fully join in with patients in their suffering and develop a deeper understanding of what is the problem the patient has, and to, with empathy and compassion, respond appropriately to advance that situation. There are folks that are perfectly suited to do that work, but by virtue of how healthcare and the system treats them, they've run out of that emotional energy. They have had their emotional intelligence flattened and overwhelmed by the way the system is organized and the expectations on what is valued of what they do. This is why I think it's important to ensure that in the patient Revolucion clinic, there's an opportunity for people to reconnect with that calling that brought them into healthcare, which is to take care of folks primarily, and to renew and to refill their compassion tank, so they can really show up at the point of care and support patients. It's very important that those at the front lines of suffering are well supported and capable and well trained, so they can be careful, they can be safe, but also that they can be respectful and kind to patients who are coming in with suffering and who like presence and understanding and listening and compassion and competent response, and all of that demands a certain kind of professional, and we need to train such people, recruit such people, and retain such people, and protect such people, and cultivate their ability to care and preserve their ability to care for the benefit of patients.
What I also appreciate about Dr. Montori's vision for a patient revolution and an overhaul of the entire healthcare system is that he recognizes that it's no easy task. More empathetic healthcare, just like a more empathetic criminal justice system, will require the efforts of many over several generations. They both must win out over very well-established systems of greed and discrimination. Dr. Montori's book details many ways in which the healthcare system has been perverted to not only put profits above proper patient care, but also placing even more burdens on the patient to perform what's essentially free labor on behalf of the healthcare industry. Here's more on that from Dr. Montori.
One of the challenges of industrial healthcare is greed. And greed works in a number of ways. The obvious ones where people are trying to find opportunities for personal profit. There where people are suffering during COVID, we've seen this in the announcements of new medications or vaccines and the inability of folks to really make those available to everyone who needs it, despite the fact that most of the research behind those innovations is funded or was funded by taxpayers. But greed is like that in healthcare. It tries to draw private profit out of a resource that is essential to ensure equity in opportunities for folks, and healthcare is one of those forces that, when effective, is capable of releasing the potential of people, potential that may be curtailed by disease and disability. So healthcare is essential, and greed extracts resources, leaving in the final common pathway of care, the point where patients and clinicians come together, a system that is severely underfunded. It was easy to see this in Peru, but in Peru the problem was poverty and corruption. So there was not enough investment in the healthcare system, and whatever resources we made available, perhaps there was poor management and not high levels of capability in the way hospitals and clinics were organized and managed. And there was significant corruption with people stealing and out of the system resources for personal gain. But we've seen with COVID a similar result here, and that obviously allows one to recognize that what we were seeing in Peru associated with limited resources, we see it here in relation to the extraction of value in the form of private profits. And so that introduces a number of things. It introduces advertisement for procedures and tests and treatments that you do not need. It introduces increased healthcare costs that are transferred to you through for-profit insurance systems that guarantee big returns for investments to its investors and executives at the cost of increased premiums. But it also manifests in clinical care, because we've convinced ourselves that patients have to do their part to make sure that healthcare organizations can achieve their targets for which they're getting paid. And so healthcare organizations turn to patients, seek to engage them, empower them, cajole them into contributing to the goals of the clinic, in essence making them unpaid workers of the clinic. They demand that they improve their outcomes so that the clinic can look good and get adequate levels of reimbursement. Which is incredible, because it's a reversal of the purpose here. The purpose should be to advance the situation of the patients and to assist those at the bedside, the clinicians, with the possibility of doing so. The whole healthcare system should be geared to support clinicians and to advance the situation of patients. But now what we have is a healthcare system that demands from patients and clinicians their fair share of work and effort to ensure that the healthcare system can achieve goals that satisfy the necessity of the payers, and to do so in a way that leaves behind substantial income so that that can be distributed privately. And so no wonder patients are often fired from practices because they are not achieving the targets of care, labeled as non-compliant because they don't make their contributions and so forth. So greed is one of the things that we must extirpate from the healthcare system, and for that we may need a patient revolution.
What's fantastic about Why We Revolt is that Dr. Montori comes up with reasonable, realistic ways in which we could curtail the greed in the industry, while still enticing smart, innovative scientists to engage in medical research, the pharmaceutical industry, and in healthcare in general. Another thing Dr. Montori hopes to do is to create a sense of institutional memory about careful, kind healthcare by creating these patient revolution clinics. And with careful and kind healthcare continuing to dwindle under the current system, Dr. Montori sees his future patient revolution clinics as almost a sort of institutional memory for future generations to rely upon. Just as the potato park in his home country, Peru, serves to maintain and preserve over 1,000 different strains of potatoes so that none can become extinct if there's ever a natural disaster, and any one of them could be used in the future in the event of a food shortage.
As healthcare continues its industrial approach, one of the things that we observe is that care is at risk of going extinct. It reminds me of the fate of multiple varieties of potatoes. As you know, the world is moving slowly towards a severe standardization of its different kinds of potatoes. I'm originally from Peru, and that's where potatoes are from. And Peru is also the place where the International Potato Institute exists. And their job, among others, is to protect the seeds of thousands of varieties of potatoes. If a blight were to wipe out the potatoes that are currently being cultivated, and we will be at risk of running out of potatoes if there was not a place like that preserves varieties of potatoes for the future. And I think that care is at risk of degrading, and there might be generations of patients and of physicians and nurses who would not be exposed at all during training or during their early years of practice to forms of careful and kind care that perhaps I saw as I was in training and in my first few years of practice. And so one could easily imagine a situation where people no longer have an opportunity to experience what care feels, and what care feels both for the patient and for the clinician. And so we hope that the Patient Revolution Clinic will be like that Potato Institute in Peru, and be a place where we can not only preserve forms of care that perhaps are extinct or at risk of going away, but also cultivate new forms of care that will beat what we have available today as a matter of course.
In terms of momentum for a patient revolution, I asked Dr. Montori whether the recent COVID-19 pandemic we all just went through might inspire us to make more positive steps towards a more equitable and caring healthcare system. Here's what he had to say about it.
The COVID-19 pandemic has been one of these disasters that is an opportunity for humans to do what Rebecca Solnit speaks of in her book, Paradise Building Hell, in which she discusses that in many disasters there's a stereotypical response where people communities become stronger, there's more generosity, there's more solidarity, there's more mutual aid, and people, there's even joy even in the face of disaster. And this lasts for some time, and then usually because those who benefit from the way things were restate or reinstall their authority, and things go back to their old normal, then people forget or stop doing what they were doing. But Solnit also brings up another issue, which is that people don't forget what they've experienced in those situations. And it suggests the possibility that when we experience a disaster, it's like when a computer gets unplugged, and when you start it again, the computer starts in a default setting. Perhaps humans' default setting is what we see right at the beginning of a disaster like this pandemic. So the issue then is, how might we take stock of the fact of what we have observed as possible outside and inside of healthcare, and how do we preserve it, or how do we remember it as we try to make healthcare more careful and kind. And I think there's a real possibility that we will not learn enough from this. We've been through SARS, we've been through Ebola, and then we are here now. It's possible that we may need several of these pandemics until we see clearly that we need a healthcare that is more capable of responding to the situation of sick people and less focused on its own efficiency, productivity, and industrial ways. In the book, Why We Revolt, we talk about some of the challenges of industrialized healthcare, and one of those challenges is the cruelty that healthcare has towards those of the frontline patients and clinicians. And I speak in one chapter about Amanda, a situation in which as a young woman who is dying of tuberculosis, a condition that I was exposed to as well in the context of caring for patients like Amanda. Tuberculosis is a preventable condition, and Amanda should not have died, except that she was dying of the severe poverty and disadvantage that a society as poor as Peru was creating the conditions for. And the hospital was not protecting the medical students like myself at the time from being exposed to tuberculosis. And so, she was dying and I was infected as a result of, poverty and corruption that takes away whatever resources are available and for private profit and ignorance and disadvantage. These were the reasons why this was happening. But to see it reproduce in COVID and to see it reproduce in the United States, I can understand how it would happen in Peru, but why is it happening here? I think that's a question that we have to continue to work through until we realize that we need a patient revolution to turn away from industrial healthcare and towards careful and kind care for all.
I couldn't agree with Dr. Montori more about the fact that easily fixable inequities and injustices should not be taking place in a country that prides itself on being so progressive and powerful. Just as people of color are still being disproportionately beaten and killed at the hands of those sworn to serve and protect, the CDC recently found that racial and ethnic minority groups suffered a, quote, disproportionate burden of illness and death, end quote, during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's time for every single one of us to do our part and demand better treatment for all. But what about those who feel as if they're ill-equipped for activism? Those who feel like they're not important enough or special enough or smart enough to make a real difference? Here's what Dr. Montori has to say on the matter.
When we published Why We Revolt, I really thought that the book will be ridiculous, that people will not think it was worth reading and considering. I've been quite surprised, frankly, that folks have found it helpful and in some cases even inspiring and a reason for hope. But still, I think most people feel that they're not called to make a big change, and the notion of a revolution brings up images of violence and discomfort that people don't know if it's worth getting into. But the truth of the matter is that we've been trained to think that big change is only brought about by extraordinary people. And we've been told of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, and we think of Nelson Mandela and these great names of people that brought about significant change, and we think that we just have to wait for someone like that to appear and help us do this. But the truth is, most substantial changes have occurred by the work of many people. Ordinary folks that history may not even remember, may not have noticed. But by not noticing, history has, as is taught to us, has convinced us that we, ordinary people, we don't have much to offer. This, of course, is false. And in fact, it's the fundamental essence of hope. Rebecca Solnit, again, wonderful writer, wrote in Hope in the Dark, this description of what distinguish pessimists, optimists, and those with hope, and it's absolutely essential. Pessimist is somebody who thinks that the world is going to hell no matter what one does. An optimist thinks that the world's going to be all right no matter what one does today. But hope is a different beast. Hope is the recognition, the world may not be good and may not get any better, but there's a shot, there's a chance, there's a sliver of possibility that it could be better because of what we do today. And that small possibility that our actions might matter in ways that we probably cannot predict, but it's possible. That's the essence of hope. To the extent that our actions can matter, there is hope, and it's our actions. And so this is one of the reasons that despite what appears to be a daunting task, a multi-generational effort to fundamentally change what we think of as healthcare, to move it away from industrial healthcare and towards careful and kind care for all, this would seem like a dream and an impossible one. But maybe if we just do something today, maybe we just might make that possibility more likely. And that is what animates me, and that's what gives me and the folks that are working with us in the Patient Revolution hope.
Even award-winning top researcher Dr. Montori didn't think his book would make a difference. But like he said, you never know who or what is going to make a change. Every movement has been comprised of so many more people than just the ones we remember attached to the movements in history. Dr. King didn't do it alone. Rosa Parks wasn't the only one refusing to move to the back of the bus. Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, none of them changed the world by themselves. They are, without a doubt, heroes and important historical figures, and we should recognize them for their efforts. But it's important to remember that behind each one of them were scores of unnamed people who were just as brave and fighting just as hard for justice and equality. So, my dear listeners, you may be shouting at your phones right now, saying, "What exactly do you expect I do to fix this mess of a healthcare system, Kate?" To that, I'd say you start by reading Dr. Montori's book, Why We Revolt.
Yeah, the book has been, again, a major surprise for me. Why We Revolt, it's available in the book, but also, in an audiobook. Unfortunately, I'm the one reading it, so apologies for that. There's also a Kindle version, so ebook. There are Spanish versions out there, Italian versions, Greek versions coming up. I'm quite surprised, actually, but volunteers are doing all this effort to try to make sure that people in other places where healthcare is also industrialized, either because of the way healthcare systems allow for profit, like here, or because of underinvestment in the systems. They want to see less industrialized healthcare, and so the book is there again to in the hopes that it will change the way they speak about the problems, the way they talk about the solutions, and the way they think about and the way they act as they try to solve healthcare problems locally. This is one way in which folks can help us is through reading the book, identifying what matters to them, sharing it with others, passing it along. They can come to patientrevolution.org, visit our website. There are some, as I mentioned, some tools to help you during the consultation. There's a story library where you can drop us a story or read the stories of others and recognize that there's a lot of us. We're not alone, and there's a great opportunity for us if we just work to get our minds together to make a substantial difference in the way care is offered, and maybe, just maybe, because of what we do today and what maybe the next few generations get to do, somewhere down the road, a person will become sick, will live with a chronic condition, and a healthcare system will reach out to them, will understand them in high definition, will respond to them with compassion, with love, and that person will be better because of the work that we do today. So I urge your listeners to join the patient revolution.
During our Zoom conversation, Dr. Montori also mentioned that he would be happy to join any virtual book club meetings that discuss his book and to discuss people's thoughts on the patient revolution. If anyone wants to put together one, especially if it's a bunch of other diabetics, I would love an invite, so make sure you email me at funkydiabeticpodcast@gmail.com. I plan to visit patientrevolution.org regularly for updates on the movement and for any opportunities there may be for continued activism. Let's join together and work with the Patient Revolution Initiative and Dr. Victor Montori to plant those potato seeds of change for future generations. I would once again like to thank Dr. Montori for his time. I once again apologize to you and to him for the technical glitches on my end during the initial conversation. I apologize that footage was basically unusable and that Dr. Montori had to take more of his time to re-record his answers. But I do hope that you've enjoyed hearing from him in today's episode. I'm not sure if you caught it, but he actually apologized to anyone interested in the audiobook of Why We Revolt, since he's the narrator. But anyone listening to this episode, I think you'd agree with me that he's got quite a charming and persuasive voice. I just might order the audiobook as well so I can hear him narrate. All kidding aside, it's obvious how much Dr. Montori cares about the medical profession and the necessity for massive changes in the healthcare system so that each and every one of us receives the careful and kind treatment we deserve. It was such an honor to speak with him, and I'm hoping to take him up on his suggestion that we speak sometime in the future to discuss the progress that we've made. In the meantime, Viva la Revolucion, and take care of yourselves, stay well, be healthy, and let's take care of each other. Thanks for listening to the Funky Diabetic Podcast. Tune in to future episodes by logging on to funkydiabeticpodcast.com, and that's funky with a PH. On the website, you'll find links to follow the podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and can submit questions, comments, and suggestions for future topics. Soon you'll be able to listen to, subscribe to, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Remember, none of the opinions expressed in this episode should be construed as medical or legal advice. Please consult a medical professional before making any change to your diet or diabetic healthcare regimen. I hope you'll be well, stay safe, and keep listening to the Funky Diabetic Podcast.